no issue is larger in scale and in theme than the issue of China. I think we should start with the big proxy issue of the China question. When Donald Trump was elected 4 years ago, and he was president-elect, Barack Obama told Trump that the most difficult issue that he would inherit was the challenge of addressing Pyongyang. That proved prescient. If you remember 2017, it was the year of fire and fury before the book came out in January. But then basically Trump shuttered a lot of the administration's North Korea policy by striking up a personal relationship with Kim. That has been specifically criticized by Biden and most Democrats. This sort of personal diplomacy, which I think has kept us out of war, is also a break in norms and how the U.S. has generally done business. So we're going to go across. Harry, what do you think we are looking at with North Korea?
Well, first of all, thanks, Curt, Gordon, Doug. Great to be here with all of you. Thanks for TAC for having us all. Well, look, when it comes to North Korea, I think we're in a little bit of an impasse. But I think also, when we think about Trump and his diplomacy with North Korea, I mean, obviously there's some very positive things to it, and there's some things that are not so positive. Let me take the positive first. When you look at the history of U.S. relations with North Korea, or absent of relations with North Korea, there's one very, very basic trend that you see. We have some sort of escalation by the North Koreans. We have the United States apply some sort of pressure, usually through sanctions, and then the North Koreans dial back. We enter negotiations. I want to focus in on the negotiations part for a second, because that's the key here. We have something that we call working level talks. You see this a lot when it comes to North Korea. We enter in these talks. Sometimes they'll be in the format of 6-party talks, which we heard a lot about in the 2000s, sometimes bilateral talks. What happens in a lot of these negotiations? Well, the North Korean diplomats are not empowered to make any decisions because, let's face it, they're afraid they're going to be thrown into the gulag when they come home, which happens quite a bit. History shows us that. So what's the result? Well, the North Koreans end up reading some sort of weird statement. U.S. negotiators try to get concessions, get to some sort of bargain. Situation falls apart, and we repeat the cycle over and over again. We've seen this for 20, 25 years. So, whether you may not like what Donald Trump has done in terms of having this bilateral relationship with Kim Jong-un, there is one benefit. We're talking to the one man who can actually make decisions when it comes to, potential denuclearization, economic reopening, liaison offices, peace declaration ending the Korean War. So I think those are good things. Now, if Biden does win, I don't see Joe Biden having this relationship with Kim Jong-un. And I will tell you, I don't want to go too far afield, Curt, so I'm just going to stop at a second. I am worried about the stability about North Korea. I mean, right now, North Korea has been hit by 3 typhoons. They're under maximum pressure sanctions. They've had to lock down the country because of COVID-19, because their healthcare system can't handle it. What does Kim Jong-un do if he doesn't have any sort of pathway to sanctions relief, or at least the hope of sanctions relief? I mean, right now, there's a lot of rumors in Seoul that the North Koreans are running out of foreign exchange reserves. That means the country's bankrupt. What do they do? So I think, I apologize for introducing a lot of questions, but I think these are the things that we need to think about. So,
I think it's important not to view North Korea as simply a puppet regime of China. They are different. Until you look at the fall of 2017, Kim had been in power for 6 years. Xi Jinping did not meet with him once. And she met for a half dozen times with Park Geun-hye, the president of South Korea. She was invited to a place of honor during their parade celebrating the end of World War II. I mean, Xi demonstrated pretty clearly what he thought at that moment of North Korea. What changed was the U.S. opening, where suddenly Xi shows up and suddenly has all these meetings with Kim. It's pretty clear Xi wanted to make sure he didn't get cut out. Because the North Koreans don't trust the Chinese for very good reasons. The shrimp among whales, they like other options, and I think that's one reason why Kim wanted to have an opening to the U.S. I think that President Trump deserves credit for trying diplomacy. He gets credit for preventing war only in the sense that he almost started one. I mean, the Fire and Fury campaign of 2017, he really ginned everything up in a very dangerous way. I mean, from the North Korean standpoint, you start wondering what the U.S. is up to, and the Armada shows up off your shore, and bombers are overflying the peninsula. your military is worth it really only if it strikes first, otherwise the U.S. will take it out. I mean, that, I think that the president, unfortunately, got us in a very dangerous position, especially where Lindsey Graham is talking about nuclear war over there. Wouldn't be such a big problem because it would be over there, it wouldn't be over here. And my South Korean friends still mention that, and Lindsey is not on their guest list anytime soon. I think the question for Biden, the challenge is that he comes from an administration which basically spent 8 years not wanting to deal with North Korea. And that was a great success. The North Koreans tested missiles, tested nuclear weapons, and built. So at the end of 8 years, the U.S. is in far better shape. That obviously ignoring North didn't work very well. Biden has said he'd be willing to meet only if conditions were met. I think the challenge, to my mind, and Harry and others, we've discussed this, is nothing will work with North Korea if you want denuclearization. I don't believe they'll give up nukes for lots of good reasons, and Libya is the most obvious. Go on YouTube and see what happened to Muammar Gaddafi. You can watch it, and it was not a very good end, and I have no doubt Kim has probably watched it and knows what happens if you give up your nukes and then the U.S. decides to take you out. So then it's a question of disarmament, and it's a question of arms control. That is, can you come up with things that are useful, capping a program, getting inspectors in, halting reprocessing, others, getting them to destroy some stuff. And I don't know if that's something which Biden is willing to do. The other, I think, challenge is, assume Biden is claimed to be president. It wouldn't surprise me if the North decides to test that big new missile they have to ensure they have Biden's attention. And that would get things started off, shall we say, in a very difficult way. And it's not clear to me how Biden would respond to something like that.
Well, thanks, Curt, and thanks to the American Conservative. I agree that certainly Biden does not want to deal with North Korea. The Obama administration didn't. But that's not the end of the issue, of course, because as you point out, the North Koreans are going to test the Biden administration. They're going to do something provocative. And my real concern is that Biden will go back to a policy that didn't work for decades, and that is trying to go to Beijing, trying to establish some cooperative relationship with China, to try to have China rein in the North Koreans. I mean, it's not only an Obama fault, it's certainly a George W. Bush fault. That was the idea behind the six-party talks, after all, to put Beijing at the center of the global community's efforts to deal with North Korea. And we know that Biden will want to try to establish some cooperative relation with Beijing, and he'll see North Korea as the opportunity to do that, but it's just not going to work. So I think that we're going to go back to failed North Korea policy and failed China policy at the same time, and we're going to start that cycle that Harry talked about, which obviously doesn't work to our benefit. I will disagree a little bit with Doug, largely because I do think that there are conditions under which we can force the North Koreans to give up their weapons. But it takes a lot of very determined diplomacy on the part of an American president, which no American leader has shown. So it is an issue of something that we could do because they are in the desperate straits, but it's not something that I think that a Biden would try to do.
Real quickly, Trump. This is basically all personal rapport between him and Kim at this point. It doesn't have the legitimacy in D.C. of the foreign policy establishment. If Trump is reelected, is he able to force through any kind of progress? Real quickly.
I do think there could be some progress, but of course it depends on what you consider progress. Back in this is early summer, I had done some reporting for the National Interest, talking about some conversations I had with White House officials who were starting to think about what one more shot at diplomacy with North Korea would look like. And it very much looked like a repackaged Hanoi deal, talking about liaison offices, an end of the Korean War through some sort of non-binding political declaration, the closure of the full Yongbyon nuclear facility, not a portion of it, but the whole 300 plus buildings at Yongbyon for some sort of sanctions relief that would have snapback provisions. So in case the North Koreans cheated, which, let's face it, they've done every single agreement, that would be the sanctions would basically be put back in place. Obviously, it didn't happen because of coronavirus. Now, would Trump do this again? Would he try to reconstitute it? Difficult to say. I mean, let's face it, we're facing 90,000 plus coronavirus cases every single day, and look at how we're doing this conference today is because of that fact. Does Trump want to put out any political capital to go for a North Korea deal? I'm not sure.
I think he probably would. I think Trump would love to have a triumph there. He's proud of the deal. He defended the deal. I mean, Biden basically accused this of being Hitler and whatnot, which I think was completely misperceiving what was going on. But I think that Trump would like to have a triumph. He'd feel vindicated. But what he needs is to have people around him who actually will support his vision as opposed to thwart it. I don't think Pompeo is that into it, and certainly John Bolton had no interest in such a deal. And the president simply has no staying power, no attention span, no interest in detail. So it certainly won't come from him. So he'd have to have, would he allow a Steve Biegun to really push this, come up with something, give Biegun the authority to, I don't know. But I think Trump would love to have the visual, and that motivates him. So if he does end up as president again, I'd expect he'd make some effort.
If you're talking about American policy with regard to North Korea as denuclearization, and you asked about whether there would be success, the answer is no. I don't think Trump is going to be that determined to be able to marshal American power. But if you think that American policy with regard to North Korea is not about nukes and not about missiles, but it's really about peeling North Korea away from China, then yes, it's actually been a successful policy so far. And one of the examples of that is that Xi Jinping actually has been paying attention to Kim Jong-un after Trump made those overtures, not before, when I think that's very insightful on your part. So, what we're seeing is the U.S. sort of viewing China as the threat, saying, yeah, we don't want North Korea to have nukes, but, it wouldn't be a bad idea if they actually pointed those nukes toward Beijing. And so we really do have, I think, a very different policy that is not stated, but is actually working. Because I think Trump would have a hard time trying to justify that to the American public. But that's actually, I think, what he's doing, because when you look at what he's doing, that's the only way that it has any sort of rationality to the policy.
So it appears near certain that a President Biden would face a divided government, i.e. the Senate. It's not full clarity because of the Georgia special elections, but it appears likely that McConnell will maintain his position as Senate Majority Leader, which means gridlock, a divided government, despite all of the fears about what a left-wing government could do. It's very possible that a lot of the Biden-Harris domestic agenda will be grounded, meaning by default, a lot of the movement is going to be on foreign policy. Biden, of course, has the background to be a foreign policy president. You can disapprove or approve of his record, but this is probably the most experienced foreign policy president since George H.W. Bush and Richard Nixon before him. But on the other hand, Biden is very much, perhaps more than any figure in American public life, out on a limb with a big record of taking a way more conciliatory approach to Beijing. During the primary in 2019, Biden, in his traditional parlance, said, they're not bad people, folks, in reference to the Communist Party of China. It clearly has some baggage here, and it's obviously whiplash from the Trump administration. What's this going to look like, especially if basically the conversation is foreign policy, is China? Gordon?
We focus on what Biden's view on China is, and as you point out, Curt, there are some very disturbing statements, because you refer to that May 1st, 2019 statement, which is inexplicable, saying that not only are they not bad folks, but they're not competition for the United States. But this is not maybe necessarily a Biden issue, because the Chinese are going to force this. Biden might, for all he want to, talk to Beijing to try to establish this conciliatory relationship. Every new American president, including Trump, actually gives the Chinese this grace period. And in Trump's case, it was all of 2017 and the first couple of months of 2018. And so Biden is going to probably stretch that out to 2 years. But the Chinese are going to force things. And I think that that's going to put Biden in a very difficult position, because remember, he's also got these Hunter Biden allegations from the New York Post that, despite everything, he has failed to deny. So I think these are going to continue to dog him. And that means that his room for a conciliatory policy is restricted as a political matter in the United States. But you got to remember, as I said, China's going to push him. China pushed the Obama administration in its early months with the assault on the impeccable and the victorious. Obviously pushed the administration of George W. Bush with the EP3 incident on April 1st, 2001. It didn't push Trump in the early months of his presidency because I think they were actually afraid of Trump and they didn't want to actually see what would happen. But I don't think they're afraid of Biden. And so there's going to be something that's going to occur. You got to remember that China's continuing to assault the United States. We saw this with their fomenting violence in the US. They did that in a number of ways. They tried to cause chaos with their social media feeds and their text messages. There are even hints that they actually put demonstrators, violent demonstrators, on American streets, specifically the night of May 31st, 1 block north of the White House. So they're going to force Biden to react. And because we're not going to go away, Americans are going to want to defend their society. We are going to have a very contentious time, and Beijing is, and I think Biden's going to have to do things he would otherwise not want to do.
I don't think he can start on foreign policy as much as assuming there's gridlock. There have already been a couple of articles out, one in the Post, one in Politico, from lefties who are horrified at the thought of Mitch McConnell having this blocking power because they're seeing their vision of adding new states, killing the filibuster, filling the courts. All of this is gone. And they're complaining and whining about it already, even before we've had the special elections that presumably there's at least a very good chance I think will deliver that. And realistically, he takes office January 20th, and we still have COVID. We still have a demand for some kind of a stimulus. And there's going to be this pent-up demand among progressives for something. And you'll see, I think a lot of that's going to be bubbling in the House. So I don't think, typically what happens with presidents is they get to the midterm of their final term. Congress goes the other way, and then they become the kind of international president and the foreign policy president because everything's dead. He will start out against that, but I think that initially he's going to have to. So there's a lot of time was going to be committed with how do you negotiate with Mitch McConnell and what do you get? So I think that's going to be there. On China is going to be a real mess for him. Just 2 weeks ago, I think it was the 60 Minutes interview, he said Russia's the biggest threat to America, which I think is utterly nonsensical. I mean, he's done a lot on the international, but he has absolutely no judgment. I mean, it's extraordinary. And then he said China's just an economic competitor. And again, I mean, if you're asking me which of these is the most dangerous country, I have no difficulty answering it isn't Russia. It's kind of the other one, maybe. But he apparently doesn't view it that way. On the other hand, there really is a consensus, I think, among the Washington policy community, including much of the, at least, kind of center Democratic blobsters, if not necessarily progressives, that China's a big problem. And I have trouble imagining that Blinken and some of these other folks would say, oh yeah, you're right, Mr. President, China's fine, let's just go have a summit with Xi and go dancing off into the lilies. I mean, I think that, and traditionally, the left has been most antagonistic towards China on human rights and on trade issues. Because historically, they were less free trade, much more concerned about labor rights, impact on workers, et cetera. All of those passions are still floating around. So I think a lot depends on who the staff is. Who does Biden pick? If he picks as National Security Advisor and Secretary of State people who are fairly consistent in their attitudes towards China, they're going to, I think, design a tougher China policy. And I think Gordon's right. There is nothing to suggest that Xi Jinping has been in any way chagrined about or anything the way wolf warrior diplomacy's turned out. It's been a catastrophe for them. I mean, they've insulted lots of people and everybody hates them. I mean, it's you look at Australia, you look in Europe, even the Germans are suddenly getting upset. I mean, yeah. But I think this is going to continue. I don't see anything to suggest that Xi is in any way willing to pull back. And if he doesn't, then I think they are going to force the issue.
Do we think this is going to be a strange redux of history? You have Biden, the standard bearer for his party, with a sort of outside the herd opinion on something like China. So you could say Trump was outside the herd on Russia within the Republican Party. Meanwhile, there's the stench of potential scandal that could potentially only be getting started once the new president is elected, and that it will, in a very strange way, force the administration almost by default to be more anti-Russia or more anti-China than I think, I mean, Purple talked about this before. But this is the most anti-Russian administration by policy since Reagan. It could very well be the most anti-China administration since, well, Trump. Harry, what do you think?
What will Joe Biden do on China? What can he realistically do? I mean, if we buy the premise that the U.S. foreign policy community has largely gone hawkish on China, which I think we can. I mean, we're obviously there's a lot of restrainers in this room who don't agree with that, but let's just buy that at face value. Joe Biden is restrained for many different reasons. I think the biggest one is because the American people are going to demand action on coronavirus. Our lives have been transformed here. And I think it's very hard to put China at the very top of the political pecking order of problems to deal with when we're dealing with hospitals that could be overflowed. We're all praying that a vaccine is going to cure all our problems. Let's face it, the day-to-day always takes precedence over problems that we still see that might be a little further downfield. So I want to put that out there first. The second thing is a very practical problem when it comes to China. For whatever reason, being in DC, I think we're all here in a bubble when it comes to foreign policy ideas and thoughts. We have wonderful conferences like this, and I think they're absolutely great, but we tend to share a lot of the same ideas. Go out to Michigan, go out to Wyoming, go out to California, and ask them what they think about China. Do they feel it's really a threat? I mean, when I've had the ability to go out to those places, a lot of people don't identify with that threat. They're not. Their first thought when they wake up in the morning isn't Chinese, carrier killer missiles or, virus attacks on our computer mainframes at the Pentagon or something like that. Their relationship with China is very different. They go to Walmart, they go to Target, they go to their discount store, and they may not know it, but they're fueling China's rise by the thousands of dollars of products that they buy from Beijing every single day. And let me give you a very real-world example of this. Before I was ever in foreign policy, one of my joys in my prior career was in technologies. Very specifically, I was in the cable industry. That industry in the last few years has blown up, and it's one of the reasons why I'm sitting in front of all of you today. Look at the different vendors of technology when it comes to streaming or televisions and any of those things. I'll bet some of you in this room have a television by a company called TCL, or maybe you have an air conditioner by a company named TCL. Look them up and see where they actually come from. They're a Chinese company, which, that isn't a shocker, but they're actually subsidized by the Chinese government. So if you buy a fancy 4K or 8K TV today, you are literally underwriting China's rise. Now, are any of the people in this room willing to do something about it? Are we willing to stop buying Chinese goods? No. We vote with our pocketbooks. And right now, I haven't seen the latest figures since of COVID, but I think we have a $650 or $700 billion bilateral trade relationship with Beijing. Are any of us willing to take the economic pain to cut that off to try and contain China's rise? Look, I believe China is a threat to this country. I have no doubt. Look, they hacked the Office of Management and Budget and stole the identity of 20 million Americans. I didn't see anybody going to the streets over it. There was upsetment, but there wasn't the anger and rage that you see over other issues in our country. So for whatever reason, I would just say that there is a recognition in our foreign policy circles that China is a problem. I just don't see the will to do anything about it. And I think that's something that we need to have a very serious conversation about.
Some people would say that President Trump had the will to do something about it. I would say the big thing that's hanging in the air if we're about to transition administrations areas, what is the fate of the trade war? Biden's advisors appear to disagree on this. We've heard some of these names put around, but in the lead up to the election day, two of his most prominent advisors have clashed on this. Tony Blinken, who's been mentioned as a possible Secretary of State, has effusively said that the trade war was counterproductive, versus someone like Jake Sullivan, who's been rumored for National Security Advisor, has taken a more nuanced position and seems to hold out the possibility of preserving protective tariffs as a measure of statecraft in a Biden administration. Trump, back in January, decades ago, signed a renegotiated trade deal with Beijing in hopes of calming the markets ahead of his re-election. Of course, the coronavirus changed history. Do we expect a Biden administration to preserve some of the trade deal? Do we expect What are the Chinese thinking right now? Are they thinking that it's just, the goal's open, it's status quo ante, or are they preparing for Biden to be more like Trump than people might imagine?
Let me take that on, Curt. So I think what you will see ultimately in a Biden administration is, look, our economy is not in good shape. I mean, it is growing, but we've only gained back, I think, 90% of the GDP that we actually lost. Our jobs are not growing at the rate we need to bring a lot of people back to work. I mean, we're all very lucky sitting in this room. For the most part, I think we all have stable jobs, stable futures. The vast majority of people do not. So I don't see the Biden administration picking an economic fight with Beijing for very practical, realist reasons. But I do think Biden will try to push back and contain China in some respects, in a lot of Obama sort of ways. I mean, look, let's face it. The United States, because of coronavirus and a lot of other bad economic decisions, is $27 trillion in debt. If we have another economic stimulus package, we'll probably be $30 trillion in debt. So the ability to take on China has been constrained. So how do we do that with the resources we have? Well, I think what you'll see is we are going to take a lot of our allies and partners and essentially turn them into porcupines. I'm borrowing a term from an article in the U.S. Naval War College back in 2010, which said that one way to limit China's rise is to essentially turn Taiwan into a porcupine. You give them advanced military technology, in a sense, to deter Beijing from doing bad things, whether we talk invasion, coercion, whatever you want to call it. Looking at the options that a Biden administration would have in this resource-constrained world, I think that might be the best option. It's not a great option, but let's face it, coronavirus is going to change our geopolitical landscape, and we can't talk about foreign policy unless we put that in our calculus. Otherwise, we're making a big mistake.
I think what's important to recognize is we're not starting in a world without a trade war. We're starting in a war with a trade war. If it was 2016, Biden wouldn't start a trade war. But I suspect there's going to be a debate among his advisors. Can you use the existence of the trade war to your advantage as you try to wind it down? I mean, the Chinese want to end it. Okay, what can you get out of them for it? To some degree, I think it's similar to the debate that's occurred on Iran. I mean, there are Democrats who say, well, yeah, we shouldn't have done what Trump did. On the other hand, we've got a lot of extra leverage. So why don't we use the extra leverage? Why don't we try to get the Iranians to agree to some extra stuff? I mean, so you're just starting at a different point. And I think that'll happen on the trade war. I don't think that they're going to be enthused about carrying it on, but I think being in one, especially given, I think, a broad consensus of wanting to pressure China, it simply won't be roll everything back. There's going to be something more to that of trying to use some of that.
Yeah, I basically see Biden sort of doing exactly what Doug says, and they're going to probably try to trade this for some opening market promises from Beijing, which China has absolutely no intention of ever honoring. And they probably will go along that path, and this is something that Republicans and others are just going to beat them over the head for, because President Trump, you mentioned the Phase 1 trade deal of January 15th. China has failed to honor its obligations on that so far. They're far behind their purchase targets, which were the core of the January 15th managed trade deal. So Biden will sort of try to develop this cooperative relation with Beijing. There'll be a trade deal, it won't work, and everyone will go after him. And I think that essentially that's going to be one of those issues that people are going to find very handy in terms of criticizing the Biden administration, because although Biden does have that long history of being experienced in foreign policy, as somebody here said, he's been consistently wrong on the big important issues, and he's going to be wrong on China, and that is going to become a defining topic in let's say the 2022 midterms.
Real quickly, another issue of divided government. Republicans appear poised to hold the Senate. That means they hold subpoena power, which means if McConnell deigns it to be in GOP political interest heading into the midterms of 2022 or the next presidential election in 2024, they could try to subpoena Hunter Biden or Hunter Biden's past associates, or subpoena Biden's associates to answer questions about alleged ties to Beijing. Again, sort of Russiagate all over again. Of course, the right think this one actually has teeth. What does that look like? What's the thought process in Beijing? How vulnerable does that make our own political system?
You know, Curt, it's a tough question, and look, let's face it, when it comes to Washington, D.C., there's a lot of corruption, or near corruption. A lot of political actors utilize their family names and get rich off it. That's terrible. Is it illegal? I don't know. I'm not a lawyer. It's tough to tell. Well, ask Doug. Doug's a lawyer. Maybe he knows. I don't know, to tell you the truth. What I fear is that, look, if Hunter Biden did something wrong, then yes, he should pay whatever the price of that is. But I have to tell you, thinking back on Russiagate and all of these, allegations that were made, I mean, the country went through political paralysis for quite a long time. Personally, I'm not going to go too far afield, but I had a lot of friends who were very hurt by this. A lot of friends who spent hundreds of thousands of dollars that were in the Trump administration that are almost bankrupt over it. And I have to be honest, they did nothing wrong except for wanting to serve their country and to go into government and then have to get pulled in front of different committees and whatnot, and they didn't have the funds to fight it. And I have a lot of other friends who are now thinking that they may not want to go into a Biden administration because they're afraid the same thing that's going to happen to them. So I would just caution that creating these political witch hunts are bad for everybody. They're bad for all of us. If Hunter Biden did something wrong, fine, but we better damn well make sure that he did it. Because otherwise I'm really afraid the ramifications of this. I mean, we're going to end up being a banana republic if every 4 years or 8 years another administration comes into office and, we're trying to settle scores. I mean, that reminds me of a third world country, and do we really want to be that? I don't think so.
I don't think we're at a point where people are going to be making judgments based on high ideals like this. I think this will be a raw political judgment. I assume that McConnell and others will, at least to some degree, take a look at the allegations and think that they have something which will be perceived by the American people as being wrong and at least embarrassing. And that'll be the reason whether they go ahead or they don't go ahead, that will this advance their political interests? I do think at some point, if it doesn't seem credible, it can rebound against you. I mean, it's not clear. You just can't throw everything out in some formal hearings and hope that it all sticks. At some point, you may embarrass yourself. But I would assume that if they think they have something there that'll work, they'll go ahead. And I agree with Harry. I think we're at a very dangerous point where, it really is demonized. It's a politics of personal destruction, and it's really awful. And, it has huge impacts on innocent people. But I don't think we're past that yet.
Yeah, it seems to me that the Biden family, there were many events which are disgusting, abhorrent, maybe not criminal. Some of them could be criminal, but I think they're minor. And I don't think the Republicans are going to use their subpoena power. But got to remember that it's not just the Republicans. There are a lot of people here who don't like Biden in the Democratic Party, who would rather see a President Harris. And I think you could very well find the left, the far left, actually promoting, jumping on a Republican-led effort. And it may not even be led by the Republicans. It might even be led by the left. There have been a number of conspiracy theorists about all this, that the Democratic Party pushes up Biden, but it really wants Harris. And I think some of these are ridiculous, but the point is there's a big constituency on both ends of the political spectrum to do Biden in. And whatever they'll do, they'll do.
Does Harris have much of a record to speak of on China?
No. What she's said is basically the trade war was lost by President Trump, which is silly, because this is an ongoing struggle. And this is not a Trump-instituted trade war. The Chinese have been attacking our economy with predatory and criminal trade practices for a couple decades. So this trade war has been a long time in the making. It's just Trump who has actually recognized what's going on and started a defense. So I think that Harris's comment shows an utter lack of understanding of what's going on, because this is a long-term struggle. I don't think China has ever really been an important part of Harris's worldview. She said a few things about she would, I think, very soon take down the tariffs, but she's not going to do that. I just don't see it.
Yeah, her entire record has been domestic. I mean, she was a U.S. attorney, Attorney General out in California. I mean, she made her name in part by being tough on crime, which progressives don't like. I mean, some of the stuff she did, were hardly progressive in orientation. She tried to use that to show that she wasn't just some, lefty, but instead was more centrist. But foreign policy has never really been her thing.
No record I know of, so.
Logistical question. Again, presuming it's President-elect Biden, future President Biden, and no one knows how long the pandemic will rage, if future viruses will come, if the 2020s will be the age of pandemics. But do you anticipate that, especially, the tensions between the world's two greatest powers at an all-time high between the two, is it plausible that Xi could come to the United States like he did early in Donald Trump's term, or Biden could go to mainland China like he did, like Trump did early in his term, or is the era of that kind of over? We had a travel ban in the early winter, or late winter, early spring, and are we basically at a point where this bilateral relationship is Russified, where they have to meet on the side of the UN, or if they have to meet in place like Singapore or Helsinki like Putin and Trump did? I know that might seem like a small thing, but it would seem, back in the Obama administration, it was fairly routine for senior officials to interchange. It seems like this bilateral relationship, just on a sort of kinetic, one-on-one interpersonal level, has changed potentially irrevocably.
I mean, how could you see a state visit for Xi Jinping right now with a 21-gun salute and a state dinner in the East Room? I mean, that's just impossible. And I actually don't think that, I agree with you, I don't see that there's going to be very much in the way of meetings in the United States or in China. I mean, if Biden goes to China, people are going to say, they're giving in to the Chinese by basically being like a tributary of traveling to the Chinese capital, as occurred during 2 millennia of imperial rule. And I don't think Biden really wants to subject himself to that. Remember, the Chinese humiliated Obama when Obama was in China with a number of different maneuvers, including the one on Air Force One. So why would Biden put himself through that? So indeed, I think we've seen the era of symmetry, at least in our country and their country, over. They will chat, as you say, on the sidelines, but we've got to remember right now that when Biden actually talks to the Chinese, he's probably going to say things that Biden knows that he believes in, but which are politically unacceptable in the U.S. Because I do believe there's a lot of anger. Yes, we will buy their goods, but I don't think that China is going to endear itself. And China will do something that will further anger the American people. So no summit meetings.
Of course, part of this, I think, in general, there's going to be little symmetry. I mean, the G7 meeting didn't happen. I mean, part of that was that Merkel, for understandable reasons, didn't particularly want to humor Trump. Nevertheless, who wanted to travel both ways, where both Europe and the U.S. are overrun by COVID virus. And I think that's going to put a damper on any kind of, I mean, will President Moon come here? Well, I mean, it strikes me it's very unlikely. They did the UN General Assembly almost entirely by video, by Zoom, that everybody kind of phoned their presentations in. And then on top of that, I do think if you have a relationship, which while it might not exactly be a Cold War, is kind of trending in that direction, it's hard to imagine the summit. Now, I mean, Nixon and Brezhnev would meet occasionally, but it's still, we're kind of entering into a radically deteriorating relationship. It's hard to imagine what you'd hold a summit for. I think if you hold a summit, it would herald some breakthrough agreement. That is, you would have something you could present. We have worked something out, whatever that something is. And I just don't see us being at that point.
How, I mean, would that have to be Taiwan big? I mean, like.
Yeah, I mean, it would be something where, I mean, it could be a trade thing where we've settled all of our economic differences. It could be we the Chinese promise we'll be nice to Taiwan and won't bomb them. If you promise, I don't know, something, or you can have North Korea if we can have Taiwan. I mean, I don't know what it would be, and I think at this stage we aren't at any point where I can't conceive of, well, we won't continue to build islands in the South China Sea. I mean, Well, that's not going to happen. We're not going to tell them we're going to stop sending, freedom of naval navigation operations. But the only way you'd have a summit, I think, would be to herald some breakthrough. And I don't see that breakthrough. Without a breakthrough, I can't imagine holding a summit in these circumstances.
Yeah, I don't see any chance of a summit anytime soon. I mean, one of the rules of politics that I've learned being in Washington for these almost a decade is that no smart politician gives their enemy ammo to use against them. I mean, that's straightforward. And I could see the Fox News segments coming right away after the summit is announced. Why is President Biden meeting with Xi Jinping when this is the country that released coronavirus on the world? I mean, that's the first thing that, people on the right are going to say. And look, you can't.
And they should say it.
Amen. I 100% agree. So why would Biden do that? Unless I agree with Doug, unless there's some wide-ranging agreement that we're all going to sing Kumbaya and the Cold War II is over. I don't think so.
Do we think the Trump summits were that much of a drag on him politically? I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, we just had a fairly closely run election. Foreign policy wasn't that big of a deal. I mean, you just have to go back. I mean, people always talk about the differences between administrations, right? The differences between Trump and Obama, and the differences between Trump and potentially Biden now. But it's something that strikes me is the underrated similarities between all three, particularly between Trump and Biden. Both of them are relationships people, and both of them are the old school, and both of them are somehow even used to a media environment that's almost pre-24/7 internet. And if Biden is the president of the United States and he wants to press the flesh with Xi Jinping, no one can stop him, just like Trump's advisors couldn't stop him from flying to Singapore.
But I don't think those hurt. I mean, meeting with Xi in March of 2017 is radically different than meeting with Xi in January 2020. I mean, and Trump did not. I mean, they didn't herald the trade.
Trump met with Putin. Again, I think coronavirus is a more substantial deal than the Russian interference in 2016. I'm happy to say that, but Trump still risked it, and half the country was very much against it.
But I just think we were at a different point.
Okay.
And we had not gone through a political campaign where both campaigns attacked the other one for having been sucking up to the Chinese, and they both did.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with what Doug is saying. China's become poison, as it should be. And we're going to see Beijing provoke to do something, as I mentioned, probably in the early part of the Biden administration, to just test them. And that is going to be very difficult. You got to remember, internally inside of China right now, China looks strong, but we also know that their economy is not growing at the 4.9% growth pace that they claimed for the third quarter. It's probably around zero. There are a lot of indications even that it's negative right now. And you have political infighting. Just remember, the Chinese did something extraordinary 2 days ago. They canceled the world's largest initial public offering of a Chinese company. This doesn't happen in the absence of intense political infighting. So something's going on in Beijing. And I think that makes it even, we talk about ourselves, our political considerations about why Trump or Biden might not meet Xi Jinping. I think there's some things for Xi Jinping not to meet us. And we got to remember that on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, there are things that are occurring that we don't know, but we do know, or at least we can suspect they are momentous. And that is going to very much affect the way China interacts with us. So it's not just a Biden question. It's really going to be, what the hell's going on inside of Beijing?
He's made a lot of enemies. I mean, Xi has made a huge number of enemies internally.
Yes, and they're waiting in the backgrounds for him to make a mistake. Yes. So for him to meet Biden could very well be a success, but it could also be a mistake. And Xi Jinping knows he is not making mistakes this month.
So I'm going to flip back real quickly. So this is the Ant IPO you're talking
Yes.
about? Yeah. So basically, for anyone who's not familiar, it's supposed to be the largest IPO in history. It was unwound because of a dispute between the Chinese government and Jack Ma. Do we have any idea what's going on there?
Because
totally
he criticized
opaque?
the Chinese banking system.
He said that it wasn't ship shape.
Yes.
And
you don't say that because
why did
it's
he
not
do
ship
that?
shape. He's telling the truth, which is threatening to their economy. I mean, they lie about statistics. They're not transparent. We don't believe any of their numbers. And this is one of the world's richest men saying the Chinese banking system isn't working very well. I mean, this was to punish him. They're making it very clear.
Why did he do it? I mean, he didn't get to be a billionaire in that system without knowing the rules.
And he's also a Communist Party member, which really adds another layer to this. You know, what Doug was referring to is on October 24th at a financial conference in Shanghai, Jack Ma called the Central Bank of China, the People's Bank of China, they called them pawnbrokers, which was a reference to their inability to lend other than on collateral. And although Chinese financial analysts will say this, and even central bank officials say this about their own institution, you just don't do it in a big financial conference. No. What drove Jack Ma to say that is because he has been, he thinks that he's been under, that the central bank has been imposing unreasonable restrictions on the Ant Technology Group. In other words, the company that was going to go public. And so he felt that he had to actually say this. And you know, what's going on here is that China nuked its own financial system, which is an extraordinary event. 2 days before it was supposed to trade, days after China took in billions of dollars, they decided not to go forward with the IPO. This has never happened before. And so the question is, it's got to be intense political infighting, because that's what occurs when you have extraordinary events.
Well, I mean, it makes them look a lot more like the Saudis, right? Which is the second biggest IPO. Like, will Aramco happen? That went on for years, and so.
Yeah, but this is yeah. There's always, you know, there can always be disagreements months before as regulators negotiate with a company. But it doesn't happen 2 days before shares are supposed to trade, after you've taken all the money.
And this undermines the system. This is given more attention to his comments. This is undermining their financial system. You just don't do this.
And remember, there's a political aspect to this, because a lot of ordinary Chinese have borrowed money at extremely high rates to get the cash to buy the shares of Ant. And these people now are suffering. And it's not just an inconsiderable number of them. So this really had to be a decision made at the top of the Chinese political system to do something that has never occurred before. I don't know what's going on, but I do know that something is going on.
I mean, does Xi still think he's playing a strong hand? I mean, their economy, the way of life, is way more normal in China than it is here.
He has to act like it. I mean, you're certainly not going to act like you're playing a weak hand. And I think the internal, again, we don't know exactly what's going on. But I mean, he's at the summit, and he's also on the precipice. I mean, this guy wants to rule forever. He can't very well give it up because he's already taken on previous guys. If he retires, they go after him. So I think the political dynamic inside is very, very tense. So he's going to have to act as if they're still strong. Even, I mean, we all know the economic and demographic problems that China has.
You view him as clearly weaker than he was a year ago internally?
Yeah, I think so.
You know, just quickly, Curt, I think one thing that's important that we think about when we're thinking about China is, has China's rise actually peaked? Are we dealing right now with a China that is at the top of its game for the foreseeable future? I think it's a fair question. I mean, look at some of the different statistics today in China. I mean, for example, China can no longer be the cheap factory of the world. I mean, one of the reasons that they're able to pull out hundreds of millions of people out of poverty is because lots of people could go into factories and make a lot more money than they could farming or doing something else. Well, I think 2 or 3 years ago, I don't know the exact date, but Chinese demographic trends were showing us that the working age population, those new people entering the workforce, was not growing anymore. It was declining. That means wages are going to start going up. And this is one of the reasons why the Chinese economy has started to shift away from, you know, being the world's factory to trying to be like the United States, to creating all these new industries like AI and autonomous cars, and, you know, hear a lot about the 2025 program to dominate all these new industries. How does China do that in a totalitarian society where free ideas, free expression aren't allowed? How do you do that? That's a very, very difficult thing they're going to have to pull off. And then just one final thing I just want to leave with. China, when they started back in the 1970s, the one-child policy, they blew up their demographics. I mean, they're now going to become a lot older country a lot quicker. So, you know, when we try to do these comparisons between the United States and China, I think you have to look at them as a country that has peaked, but I think that also makes them very dangerous, because the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party has been economic growth, to guarantee its citizens a better life and a better future. What happens when they can't do that anymore?
Well,
that makes them dangerous.
In fairness to the Chinese, I think they might say the same about us.
That's true.
No, but you have a
respect, sure.
society with fewer institutions, fewer bounds. You know, Harry Ford talked about how it is dangerous for one party to go after the other, and yes, it's right. But this is standard operating procedure in China right now. And remember, Xi Jinping has raised the cost of losing a political struggle. So, you know, he doesn't retire. I mean, if he leaves, he loses his freedom, he loses his assets, he loses his life. That's the nature of the Chinese political system right now. It's very similar, not quite, but it's very similar to what occurred in the Mao Zedong era, where intense internal struggle was really life or death. And so you've got a political system right now where Xi Jinping needs to be strong. He is strong until he isn't, until he makes a mistake. And as Harry says, it's dangerous. And just one point about demography, you know, China right now is about 1.4 billion people. They're starting their next census. But if total fertility rate doesn't change, which is now about 1.1, China's going to be about 480 million people at the end of this century. So think about how the long-term trends are against China. And I think that means that Chinese leaders see a closing window of opportunity, because it's not just demography, it's their economy, it's their environment, it's a rest of people, it's an unhappy Angela Merkel and the rest of the world. So I think that Xi Jinping realizes that if he wants to accomplish China's, what he sees as historical objectives, he's got to act now. And by the way, who's president of the United States? Well, it's Biden. So he thinks he probably can score a few points against the U.S.
In that vein, two closing questions, basically yes or no. Do the Chinese move militarily on Taiwan in the next 4 years? And is a basically Cold War paradigm unshakable, inevitable at this point? Harry?
No, yes.
No, no.
No, yes.
Cool. Thanks. Appreciate it.